In this video, we are going to begin looking at Chapter 32. Chapter 32 covers aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Or it might have them switched around in the textbook, aggregate supply and aggregate demand. But what these are used for, what we're doing, is we're essentially trying to build a model to help us explain kind of the business cycle, or look at the business cycle. All right, the business cycle, right, these are the fluctuations in the growth rate of real GDP around its trend growth rate. Right, and so we will be developing this model of aggregate demand and aggregate supply to examine the business cycle. In this video, we are going to focus on looking at aggregate demand, but we will throw in aggregate supply when the time comes. All right, so let's go ahead and start looking at aggregate demand. All right, so what we're doing here with our aggregate demand and our aggregate supply, think of this as, an aggregation. It's collecting things up, putting them together, and that's what we're doing here. We're looking at the economy as a whole. So instead of looking at one firm's supply or demand curve or one industry's supply and demand curve, we are trying to get an idea about the supply and demand of the entire economy as a whole. That is what aggregate demand is. Right? And we're going to be abbreviating this AD because aggregate demand is kind of a long word, and I don't want to have to write it a million times. Right? So AD, that's aggregate demand. When we start graphing, that is how we will do it as well. All right, so we are going to start by looking at the aggregate demand curve. All right, so this is all combinations of inflation and real growth that are consistent with a specified rate of spending growth. All right, so hopefully we can kind of pick out some of these things. I'm going to highlight some stuff or underline some stuff. You don't necessarily need to do this because you'll have this information written down later. All right, but we can see we've got inflation and real growth, right? So inflation and real GDP growth rate. We were using both of these in the last chapter, right? In the chapter on inflation, we looked at that quantity theory of money equation. These two variables, right, the inflation rate and the real growth rate, they were on the right-hand side. And spending growth, we will see in just a second. All right, that is the left-hand side of the equation. All right, so that's the money supply growth rate plus the velocity of money growth rate. All right, so it all comes back to this quantity theory of money. That's kind of a jumping off point for us. All right, but what our graph, right, what our curve is actually going to look like. All right, so this is our aggregate demand. Instead of having the usual things on our axes, normally we would have price and quantity. We're not going to have those on the graph for our aggregate supply and aggregate demand stuff, right? So instead of the price, what we're going to have is the inflation rate, right? Instead of the quantity, we are going to have the real GDP growth rate. Then we are going to say our spending growth rate, which yeah, we can make this work. Right. Right, which is the money supply growth rate plus the velocity of money growth rate. We'll set it equal to something. For this example, let's say it's equal to 5%. Now, if we remember our money quantity theory of money formula, we will remember that the money supply growth rate plus the velocity of money growth rate, which is our spending growth rate, equals our inflation rate plus the real GDP growth rate. So this 5%, right, we're going to be kind of putting it in terms of inflation and real GDP growth, right? So all of the combinations of inflation and real GDP growth that are going to sum to 5%, right? All of those points make up our aggregate demand curve, right? So kind of our endpoints would be as follows. All right, so at a real GDP growth rate of 0%, right, we would expect an inflation rate of 5%, and at an inflation rate of 0%, we would expect a real GDP growth rate of 5%. And then, of course, we could lie anywhere on this line, but wherever we are, the value that we would get for the for the inflation rate has to equal 5% when added to the inflation. Or that's a terrible way of saying that. Wherever on this line, right? It can be anywhere on this line as long as the real GDP growth rate and the inflation rate add up to 5%, right? And if we, actually kind of graph that with actual, Excel or something, that would be the case, right? But just because you draw it and then you put something on there doesn't make it the real thing, right? But that is our aggregate demand curve, right? And so this is going to be important as we go forward. Again, the money supply growth rate, velocity of money growth rate, so that spending growth rate. Also, we can think of it as, right, how often a dollar circulates through the economy, or the growth rate at which a dollar circulates, the number of times a dollar circulates through the economy in a year. That's our velocity of money growth rate. And then our money supply, so we're essentially saying how much money do we have, right? How often does it circulate through the economy, right? And that's going to give us kind of an idea of how much stuff people are buying, right? Because if, for this money supply, we are, every time kind of a dollar circulates through the economy, right, and then every time it's spent on final goods, right, well, people are spending that money because they want the goods. So that's kind of, we can kind of think of that when we think of demand. All right, so now let's talk a little bit about shifting aggregate demand. That's one of the things that we always talk about with this kind of stuff. All right, we want to know what's going to happen. All right, what can change aggregate demand? All right, the short answer is aggregate demand is based off of a specified spending growth rate. So if we change that spending growth rate, we're going to change aggregate demand. And the spending growth rate is made up of two things. It's made up of the money supply growth rate and the velocity of money growth rate. So the two ways that we can shift demand is we could change the money supply, right? Increase or decrease the money supply. All right, so increasing the money supply or increasing the money supply growth rate, really either way you want to say that is fine. We could just go ahead and say the growth rate because that's what's in all of our notes already, probably. And that one's pretty simple. There's really one way that this happens, right? The money supply increases when the Federal Reserve, at least in the U.S., when the Federal Reserve creates money. All right, so whether they're printing it or doing something else to create money, that's when we're going to see an increase in the money supply growth rate. All right, increasing the velocity of money growth rate also increases the aggregate demand. Well, yeah, I don't know why I said it like that, but it does increase the aggregate demand, right? So changes in the money supply, or excuse me, the velocity of money growth rate, that can take on a couple of different forms. So let's take a look at those, right? They are based off of the components of the national spending approach to GDP, right? So if we don't remember, I'm going to go ahead and just throw these up here real quick, and I'm going to put them in form of growth rates. All right, so changes to these four components of the national spending approach to GDP, right, are going to lead to changes in the velocity of money. Right, so essentially, right, so this is the consumption spending growth rate, the investment spending growth rate, the government spending growth rate, and the net export growth rate. So if any of those are increasing, right, that means that people are increasing the amount of stuff they're buying, right? That's going to increase the velocity of money, because the faster you buy something, once you get a dollar, the faster you buy something with it, the faster it can circulate back through the economy. All right, so changes to these can change our velocity of money, and by changing the velocity of money, change the aggregate demand. All right, so really these fall in kind of, they do the same thing. Whatever direction these growth rates move in, that's the same direction that the velocity of money is going to, or the velocity of money growth rate is going to go. So if consumption spending growth rate increases, the velocity of money growth rate is going to increase, and the aggregate demand is going to increase. All right, but some of the things that you might hear, all right, so kind of confidence in the economy. This can be something that's going to affect our velocity of money. All right, so if it's consumers, all right, let's say consumers lose confidence. Actually, I want to maybe clarify that. So Right, if consumers lose confidence in the economy, all right, that means, hey, maybe their economic prospects aren't looking too good at the moment. So maybe instead of taking their disposable income and going out to eat in restaurants or going and doing different things and just spending that money, right? If they're worried about the future, they might instead save it, right? So that would mean that money is not circulating through the economy as quickly because people are holding on to their money, right? So the consumption spending growth rate would decrease, right? That's the people holding onto their money, right? Because they're holding onto their money, the velocity of money growth rate is going to decrease, which is going to decrease aggregate demand. All right, so this is the general way of doing it. All right, so for the flip side, and just so we can do one with the investment spending, let's say investors have confidence in the economy, right? Again, there's a lot of things that could affect this. So investors have confidence, they think that economic prospects are good. So maybe they say now's a good time to build that skyscraper, right? Maybe now is the time to purchase all of the new machinery that we want, right? Replace our old stuff, right? So the investment spending growth rate increases. That leads to a velocity of money growth rate increasing and to the aggregate demand increasing as well. All right, so there are plenty of things that could go through all of these. Right, so consumers, if we're talking about changes to consumption spending, consumer confidence, how confident consumers are in the economy, that's going to affect this. Taxes will also affect consumers if they are income taxes, right? If you change the income tax, let's say if you increase the income tax, that means that fewer people have less money, right? Their income is lower. The income they get to spend, right? And so the spending growth rate is obviously going to go down, right? If consumers don't have as much money to spend, right, they're not going to spend it, right? Consumer confidence, then taxes, all right, those are going to play a role. And of course, the opposite is true. If you lower taxes, you can increase aggregate demand, right? Investors, once again, investor confidence, that's going to play a role. Taxes, once again, if you are taxing purchases on capital, right? That's going to discourage investment, right? So if you are saying, hey, if you buy all of these new, machines for your factory, we're going to tax. You're going to have to pay a 20% tax, right? Then some investors, right? Some people might decide not to invest in that capital at the moment. Government spending. That's really just going to be based on kind of what the government wants to do. We'll talk more about that when we look at the federal budget in the next section of the class. But any changes, so if the government decides to increase spending, decrease spending, again, that's going to affect it in that direction, right? An increase in government spending is going to be an increase in the velocity of money growth rate. That is going to lead to an increase in aggregate demand, right? And then net exports, anything that's going to change that. Remember that our net exports are our exports minus, or the value of our exports minus the value of our imports. So if something with trade relations changes, that could affect our net exports. All right, but that is it for our aggregate demand. So in the next video, we are going to start looking at aggregate supply, and then kind of at some point we're going to put everything together. All right, but that's it for this video. I will see you in the next one.